great introduction. I'm going to record it, and I'll play it back every time I have a conference presentation in the future. So my talk today is TBA.js, and that's basically a synonym of a presentation about everything we do at Zeit. So the introduction that they just gave us is really great because it kind of tells you about the story of how all these projects came together. And today what I thought about giving you is a little tour by example of all our projects. So the title of this presentation is Next.js by example. And I'm going to walk you through step by step how to build something really nice during the course of this presentation. So my name, of course, Guillermo Rauch, as the introduction said. You can find me on Twitter. And the thing that we do at Zeit is simplify processes that are seemingly too complicated, too burdensome, things that want to make your skin crawl, like they said earlier. So our main product is now. You go to any directory, you run now, and you get a URL to your deployment. And with this tool, you can deploy static websites, Node.js projects, and Dockerfile projects, all serverlessly, which means you don't set up anything, you just run now and you get a URL. So when we were coming up with this project, we thought about building a really neat UI for you to see everything that's going on with your cloud. And we wanted to have all these really cool features like real-time updates, dashboards that were interactive, offline support, stateful components, and so on. Custom fancy URLs, kind of like a GitHub type experience. Server rendering, for example, showing the logs of your deployments in real time. But the problem that we had is we had built this really great deployment tool, but we didn't have the counterpart to actually build that web UI. We couldn't do that with just one command. So what we came up with in an exercise of great naming conventions, we came up with now, and then we came up with next. So the only thing that you have to do to start a Next.js project is bring in these three dependencies: Next, React, and React DOM. So this is everything that you have to do to set up a React project that has all the aforementioned features. So instead of dealing with boilerplate projects that you have to clone, setting up configuration by yourself, or dealing with the uncertainty of whether you're doing the right thing for development and for production, for example, Next takes care of it all for you. And the only requirement that it has is that you have a pages directory. So for those of you who are familiar with PHP, for example, there's this great notion that you can use the file system as an API itself. Like, the file system is already there. We have conventions already, like there is package.json, there is node_modules. So we took that one step further and we said, okay, we'll add a pages directory where your screens or the entry points into your application will go. And what you get as a result is you run Next and you get a server that runs your application and you start interacting with it. And for that example that I just showed earlier, so we cat welcome to my page, you would get this. And this sounds very simple. It sounds like something we would do 20 years ago and would be celebrating. But what else do you get other than getting that little title? So I'm going to walk you through, hopefully I have time, all of these features that you get out of the box by running Next. So the first one is Hotcode reloading. And specifically, I'll tell you how Next.js does Hotcode reloading, which is really interesting. So in the introduction, they mentioned Hyper, so I'm going to open Hyper, and I'm going to create a project called Nordic.js -next. And let me know if you can see properly. Awesome. One person at least can see properly. So I'm going to add the dependencies, and I'm going to save them to a package.json file. This process can take a little bit, but I was told I was in the speaker's Wi-Fi, so this should be really fast. Great. FS events, always at the end. Shout out to the creator. So what we get is these three really neat dependencies, and that's all you have to do to set up your project. The next thing that you have to do is set up a few scripts. So there is a script that is just development, and as I said earlier, I promised it would be one command. There you go. Then there is a build step, which is when you go to production, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, because the idea of very easily going to production is a very, very cool concept that comes with Next.js. Obviously, for example, you're not going to want source maps and like all this like bloated things to go to production. So Next makes this really cool distinction between the development environment and the production environment. So if I run npm run dev now, it's going to tell me that I don't have that pages directory. But other than that, this is basically all we have to do. We brought in those 3 dependencies, and then we set up that pages directory. So inside pages, I'm going to create an index.js file. So I'm going to run dev. Now I'm satisfying the constraint that I have a pages directory. And I'm going to go to that URL. Notice that Next.js automatically handles some of the stuff that, again, you would have to do manually, like handling top-level errors. So Next.js takes care of bubbling errors, for example, internal server errors. So we automatically send you a 500 error. Missing pages, we automatically give you a 404. And obviously, you can override those later. The next thing I do is export a function. Hello, world. For those of you that are not familiar with React, the great thing that React did was really make UI functional. So notice that my page is just merely represented by exporting this function. And within that function, I'm including a React element. In JSX, the HTML-like syntax that you see there, I'm going to increase the font a little bit more, and I'm going to double check. Yeah, it looks good. What you see this HTML-like syntax is inside JavaScript is basically sugar for instantiating a bunch of objects. So really what I'm doing is I have a function that returns my UI. The contract that Next.js imposes on you to create any sort of application is that you create a file that exports a component, which can be a function or a component class instance. So as you can see on the right-hand side, I have my hello world little title. And one thing I mentioned was Next.js is very good at hotcode reloading. So I'm going to start changing the markup in some fundamental ways, and you're going to notice that it responds perfectly. One gotcha, for example, would be a syntax error. So I'm going to bring the font size back down. So there I just broke my tag. Normally with HTML, this would result in some really weird, undefined behavior, but luckily for us, JSX is a very strict syntax. So I can correct my syntax errors, and the page is always responding automatically on the right-hand side. So Next.js makes hot module replacement automatic with no setup, and it handles a lot of edge cases that really suck. So another one of those is our friend undefined is not a function. So I'm just going to include a function called undefined. Notice that undefined is not a function. So the subtlety here is that this is a runtime error. So while Next.js is building your project, it finds that error and says, OK, you have to correct it. Similarly, inside my render code, I can also have runtime problems. So consider, for example, I'm going to introduce another error here, like undefined here. Sorry about that. Yeah, there you go. And now I'm going to correct the final syntax error. And there you go. So you can recover from errors from HMR the same way that you could include new things or take away things. So error recovery, runtime error handling, and syntax errors are all handled by the same system. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about our next feature, which is automatic routing. So I kind of showed you before that all I had to do to create a project was set up my index.js file inside that pages directory. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create a new page inside that pages directory called about.js. So before I even save that file, I'm going to go to the route. So this is what we call automatic routing. The idea that by default, and you can override that later, any URL that you go to, you can map to the file system. So now I'm going to go ahead and export another function. And I'm going to say about page. So notice on the right-hand side where that page used to be a 404 is going to turn into my about page. And now I can seamlessly navigate between the pages that I've defined and Next.js has automatically set up the routes for. In more complicated projects, you might want to override this behavior. But Next.js allows you to do that by setting up a specific route mapping configurations that you can still map to these top-level components. And these top-level components are also going to be the entry points for code splitting. So the things that you include in one page or the other are separate universes. And that's a feature that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But before, we're going to talk about single-file components. So I defined my components as exporting functions or classes, but we're missing something fundamental that Next.js gives you a lot of help with, which is the styling. Every time you start a project with React, you have to make a bunch of decisions with regards to how you solve styling. But the reality is the web already has a styling solution, which is CSS. Now, CSS has been very controversial because it has this sort of weird default behavior. In particular, every time you include a style tag, you're defining global components for your entire application. It would be as if JavaScript didn't have scopes and every variable was automatically a global variable. And not only that, it also impacted the work of your teammates or peers. Because, for example, you define the styles for a paragraph, and it impacts every single paragraph on the system. So I'm going to show you how Next.js solves this problem for you. So I'm going to go back to my index page, and I'm going to introduce here a style tag. Now, this style tag would be equivalent to every other tag that you could define in React with two fundamental differences. One is I included the JSX tag to indicate that that style tag is only going to impact the JSX elements that I statically defined. Secondly, it allows me to put in my styling without escaping it. So without having to do dangerously set inner HTML for those of you that are familiar with React. And we do this at compile time, which means your end users and your consumers don't spend any time at all processing CSS. We solve problems like automatic prefixing and like things that are typically very annoying. So now I'm going to do some styles that are very dear to us now because they solve the centering problem. So hopefully, yeah, I centered it. Thank God. This used to be very hard. So my div here, and we're going to inspect it right now, is like every normal CSS instruction that you would define. So we're going to focus on the div, with the difference that we're automatically suffixing it with a specific identifier that belongs to that component. So this is what we call the single file component approach, but it's actually a little bit cooler in Next.js. So if you've used Vue.js or Svelte or other technologies that allow you to sort of put your styles together with your code, with your JS code, it's cool that they do this prefixing stuff, and it's cool that you're co-locating it and you have it all in one place. But Style.jsx goes a little bit further by considering this a language construct. So for example, you can take these styles and you can externalize them into a separate file that you import. So you're able to use the import module system that JavaScript already has to include styles. Similarly, you can do constants. So for example, I'm going to do bg color equals magenta. No, magenta. And now we're going to see a little gotcha that we have once we inverted this model that CSS had, which was everything used to be global, now nothing is global. So let's try it out. So we're going to do background, bg color. And the cool thing here, you're going to notice I'm using template tags, so I can embed any constant or variable that I want. So once I save this file, you're going to notice that nothing happens. And the reason is that body is a global element, and it's not within my scope of this function. So for that, we give you a convenience similar to CSS modules, where you can define some escape hatches for your isolated CSS. So you can see how beautiful this looks. I always go ahead and do this. Nice. So I'm going to show you another thing which I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that we go a little bit beyond single file components because we're using the JS scoping system. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to define a new component. I'm going to import component from React. The table is a little. And we're going to call this title. So this is why I like the functional approach more. This is a little bit more involved. But it's the same idea as before. We have a render function that returns a bunch of stuff. So here I'm going to say, hello, Sweden. I apologize for our incomplete emoji rendering. And I'm going to also bring back my marquee, which is really cool. I'm also going to wrap it here with main tag. And here I'm going to include my component. So for those of you that know React, you already know that basically every element can also be wrapped inside a component. So elements and components are kind of the same thing, only differ by the uppercase letter in the beginning of the opening tag. So we have an uppercase T there, and that points to that component down here. So just to underline the point about styling a little bit more, I'm going to show you that if I have this main tag here, and I say with something like that, once again, that's only going to be isolated to that particular instance of the main component. So now Next.js, and this is a Babel transformation that, by the way, you can use in your projects completely isolated. You're going to see that it generated a different signature for that particular style instance. So if I tried here to define more, like, for example, a beautiful green color, you're going to see that it's not going to impact my other main element. So this solves a major, major pain point that has to do with scaling your projects, that has to do with collaborating with others and bringing in styles and sharing components, etc. So if now I come back here and I say color green, it's going to work as expected. I apologize for ruining the branding of Sweden with this colorful constructs. So now we can see that we can retain all the paradigms that we already have in React, such as component composition, but we brought in the idea of styling as a first-class citizen that also works with another feature that we're going to talk about, which is server rendering. So server rendering allows us to decide ahead of time how much content is going to come with the page. So typically, when we design JavaScript applications, we deal with this idea that we load a JavaScript bundle, and that bundle is in charge of rendering. But with Next.js, we give you the possibility to decide ahead of time how much you want to pre-render with the page. So to demonstrate that capability, I'm going to go and say, to the view source, and you're going to see that most of the things that I defined there already came with the page. So when you're developing a Next.js application, you might want to, for example, fetch some data and render it with the server. Or maybe you want to do an application shell that you want to pre-render with the page as well. So we give you that entire spectrum of possibility. You could even render nothing on the server, and through the lifecycle hooks that React gives you, like component did mount, you could do all your work there, and the page would be completely blank. So connected to server rendering is this idea that we play really well with the React and the NPM ecosystem. So I would say the difference between Next and other tools is that we tried really hard to not create things that didn't play well with the rest of the JavaScript ecosystem. So for example, the capabilities of styling that I just showed you are actually an independent module. And when it comes to the entire and the rest of the JavaScript ecosystem, if I wanted to bring some data to render with the page, all I have to do is bring the project isomorphic fetch. So fetch is the WhatWG new API to replace the old and dear XML HTTP request. Since Next.js has this capability of doing stuff on the server and on the client, fetch is going to be absent in Node. So if I do Node and I do fetch, fetch is not defined. However, if I require isomorphic fetch, love that word, now we have fetch. So that's all it takes really for us to have this idea of universal dual rendering between client and server. Obviously, you can use anything. You don't have to use fetch, but it's kind of nice because it's sort of become the universal way now for talking to different servers. So to illustrate how that works quickly, I'm going to import isomorphic fetch. And that's going to give me the fetch on both sides. There he goes. And obviously, it's going to be in Node as well. So I found this API earlier today that is going to give us some JSON data to play with. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to use this JSON placeholder API that gives us like a bunch of data. We're going to take it, and it looks kind of random. Actually, let's use the images one. I think there's an images one. Cool. So I'm going to take this API, and I'm going to make an HTTP request from the server. Next.js is going to make that request. As I said earlier, if it fails, it's going to take care of handling the errors on our behalf, something that typically used to be very hard to do in the Node.js world because we're dealing with the life cycle that is sort of global, and we're dealing with callbacks. So I'm going to show you how Next.js is going to relieve you of all that pain. First, I'm going to convert this into a component. I need to create some sort of macro to do that. If anyone has one, let me know. And I'm going to return my previous tree. And later, we're going to add some state as well. So if this worked out, okay. Thank you, React. It fixed itself. Great. So what we're going to do is we're going to add the hook that Next.js added to the React lifecycle, which we call getInitialProps. If you remember, if you're familiar with React's old API, we had getInitialState. But we never had a way of getting props that were pre-populated with the page or served by the server. So that's what we added to the framework. So we call this getInitialProps. Very simple. So getInitialProps gets a context object and a request object, and it returns a promise. So what it means is that you can take any data source in the world and return it through getInitialProps. It doesn't really matter where it's coming from. Today, for this example, I'm going to use fetch, but really you could use anything. So notice that I defined the function as being async. So now I can use await here, which is pretty cool. And I'm going to go back to my API here to get photos. And if it's OK, which means it's positive status code, I'm going to return the photos. So one way of doing that is to await also the JSON object from that. So this object that I'm returning here is going to become the properties that are pre-populated with my component once it's rendered and once it's reconciliated. So notice down there it says constructor props. Those props that are initial are coming from this hook that we have here. If we didn't have photos, for now, here you could do more error handling and stuff like that. But for now, we're going to just return the empty array of photos. So to verify that it worked, we're going to use our trusty console log. And the good thing about Next is you can sort of discover everything by just doing console log a bunch of times. That's what I do. So notice here that it's actually being output on the server side as well. I get all my photos from my API. As I mentioned earlier, because the contract is that you have to return a promise, there people go nuts. So like you can get your data from Apollo, you can get your data from XML APIs if you want. You can get really your data from even the local state inside the Node.js process. So you could do really cool caching stuff and in-memory memoization of everything that you're working with. So we're going to do some really quick rendering here because now that we have the props, they're exposed automatically to my render function. So it's probably not going to look pretty, but we're going to do it anyways. YOLO. So I'm returning that I'm iterating over my photos array, and then from the photo I'm interested in getting the thumbnail URL and perhaps the title. So here let's do a div. React 16 is going to support fragments, so I wouldn't have to worry as much. Actually, I don't know if maybe we already support React 16, but I don't remember. And then I'm going to do here thumbnail URL. Oh, I forgot one thing. This API is returning 5,000 photos. So my MacBook 12 was sort of exploding. So let's slice it if my computer doesn't crash. Yeah, it's still rendering. I don't know what it's doing on the right-hand side. It's pretty wild. Chrome is in there a lot of pain right now. Okay. How much? All right, there you go. So I probably don't have a lot of time left, but so I'm going to rush through this. I render my photos, and I mentioned this earlier. They come with the initial response. So never mind this stuff at the top, that's development mode only, but you're going to see that when I pre-render everything from the server side, I'm already getting all that data with all my placeholders and all my photos and stuff like that. So that's really neat. And it took very little effort to get some data. And as you navigate through pages on Next.js as well, you're able to load this data dynamically on the client side as well. So we're not only relying on the server to get this data, you can also do it as you're transitioning on the client side. Automatic code splitting means that this specific pages, for example, this one required fetch, but the about page that I defined before doesn't. So if we inspect the source code, you're going to see that at the very end of the file, it's including a page only for the about page. So automatically, it's looking at all my imports in a file, and it's saying, I'm only going to bring the about page for this, which is not going to include fetch. And the same is going to happen here. It's going to return a completely different set of scripts. And the nice thing as well is that Next.js takes care of including the preloading tags. So in the future with React16, we plan to do more streaming stuff, which means as the server is getting data and processing the different parts of the subtrees, we're going to be streaming HTML. So in preparation for that, we're including preload tags so that your bundles are being loaded as the HTML is being streamed, which is really neat. Prefetching is one of my favorite features because one thing that made single-page applications very popular in the JavaScript world was everything is instantaneous. Everything is just very snappy to load. So how does Next.js solve that problem if we do automatic code splitting and we have all these different universes? When you use the link tag in Next.js to connect different pages, we can prefetch all the JavaScript on demand while the user is navigating through your application. So the end result is that all the pages are very snappy. Even though you might have not gone to them, they're going to be very, very snappy to load. So, for example, here we did some server rendering. So like I got my image and my avatar and all that stuff. And you're going to notice if I start navigating through the site, there's an exception here because we load a component dynamically. But as I start navigating through the site, all the pages are going to be preloaded on the background. And one really neat feature that we're going to introduce with Next.js 4 is we're going to give you an additional hook to respond to preloading events. So what I did here essentially was I connected all these pages through link tags, which means I'm not doing a full server rendering. I prefetched the JavaScript bundle for the other pages. Obviously, I didn't do it. Next.js did it. And on the background is getting all of that. Starting with Next.js 4, we're going to give you a component did prefetch hook. So notice here that when I go to OSS, it takes a little bit more time because we're getting these projects dynamically from GitHub through get initial props in the same manner that I just downloaded all those 5,000 placeholders. So, but it would be really cool if the user is not doing anything interesting that we could prefetch that data on the background. So that's where we're going to introduce component did prefetch. And all you have to do to trigger these connections between pages is use a link tag that comes with, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go really fast. But if you did this, that would be all you have to do to connect pages together. And then you add prefetch, and bam, everything is prefetched seamlessly. So I talked about code splitting, and that means that all the JavaScript for all the modules and all the components that you load with the page come with one single JavaScript bundle. In a lot of cases, you don't want to do that because you want to preload stuff as the user is interacting. So for example, if you have a modal component, you might want to only load it if the user hovers a button that is going to trigger a modal, for example. So for that, we added support recently for importing a dynamic component. And you can find that in the Next.js documentation. Finally, I mentioned earlier that the only thing that you have to do to go to production is, sorry about that, is defining these two scripts. So next build and next start, and you go to production. With an additional step that we called next export, Next.js is going to give you an out directory with a bunch of HTML files, JavaScript files, and JSON files, if you so desire, so that your entire application is compiled statically. And I recommend that you look at the Next Electron project, because that's how we build our applications for Electron as well. So this that you have here is the Next.js Now application. So this uses all the features that I just mentioned earlier, like routing and code splitting and all this really cool stuff. But because it's Electron, we don't run a server. There's no point in running a server. we use the static exports feature. If you have any questions whatsoever, and I apologize for going a little bit long, you can reach out to me. And I also was told that we're going to be on the side answering questions later on. And I have a few links that I want to share. The most important one is learn.next.js.com. It's going to walk you through basically everything that we did today. Then we have a clone of Hacker News called Next News. And it's fully open source, and you can find it here. I think it's in Now Examples. So this clone of Hacker News uses all these really cool features that I just talked about. Also here on this particular page, you see how we loaded data dynamically as well. So Next News is there. And I recommend also that you please star our repository so that more people learn about Next.js and enjoy all these really cool features. That's all for today, and I look forward to your questions and meeting you later. Thank you.